Hello and welcome to the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. This is episode 31. My name is Bruce Gemmel. I'm a researcher in architecture and a draftsman. And what I mean by draftsman is draftsman in the classical sense of, like, say, Leonardo da Vinci or someone like that, Raphael, Michelangelo. Anyway, so this is episode 31, Understanding and Judgment as Regards Authority. And the subtitle is Authenticity of Authority. Now, this is a series of ruminations I've been doing since December. It's the second time I've kind of presented these. And what happened was the platform that I was using initially was kind of unworkable. So I basically transferred to this one. I find that YouTube has actually been quite agreeable. So we started with the operation of the metaphor, which is kind of like a foundational idea for me in terms of my work. It kind of talks about the idea of the operation of the metaphor as in a kind of broad sense. Most people, I think, would understand it in terms of the aesthetic aspect that we would see in, say, painting and writing and music. And I basically kind of see that too, but I basically see that as something that we don't get from language, but kind of inherit from nature. So I broke that down into three pieces. The first piece, which I found was, the relationship of the organic metaphor, which is something that I think kind of gave me a lead to what my own work would be in terms of architecture. And I talked about that. And then we talked about the relationship of that in our understanding of aesthetics. And then finally kind of came up with something called unbreakable bonds, which is kind of like a proto-metaphor or kind of like a social metaphor, but it's kind of complete. It's kind of not fully formed, but it is something that we can kind of use, and we find it's kind of fairly useful. So, kind of like that was something that would. And then we talked about criticism. We talked about different aspects of ideas in terms of the useful articulation of kind of work. Talked about authority, which was something we talked about kind of in terms of the nature of ideas. But this is kind of related to that in terms of like the idea of understanding and judgment as relates to authority, which was something that we kind of said we'd come back to. After that, I talked about architecture specifically. I talked about my past and how my youth kind of formed my interest in architecture, even though I wasn't really sure what that was. We talked about Leonardo da Vinci and my kind of great memory of Queens Village Public Library, which was where I met with Mrs. Rosen, and Mrs. Rosen was the person who introduced me to the love of reading, the love of books, and the love of study. And it's where I discovered my hero, and still my hero to this day, along with Bugs Bunny, Leonardo da Vinci. Then talked about that as it took me into, including school, then into my professorship. And then from there, the last part, which was the organic design thinking, which was where we kind of left off. And then we kind of went through some other things. After that, we talked about indicators of societal health, which was actually going back to the unbreakable bonds and the aspect of the metaphor. Now, an unbreakable bond, to recap, is something that combines, that gives us a purposefulness or usefulness in terms of like society, but it also, in terms of its value, not only kind of charts the progress of society, but also can be checked in terms of how society may kind of be healthy or unhealthy, in terms of how well it treats those things that are most important to it. And we found that that was something we noticed with criticism, which is very vital aspect of a kind of rationally based, logic based nurturing of our desires. That criticism should not fall into disrepair, but it has kind of societally fallen into disrepair. So we kind of saw that as something we needed to be concerned about. From there, we talked about traditions and culture. Then we talked about some specific things of what could be used to kind of chart the progress of our own culture. We talked about things related to Whitehead's adventures, ideas. We talked about truth. We talked about beauty. I introduced love as the correlation of truth and beauty. And there was also the articulation of those things that were also in and amongst those ideas And we kind of talked about truth, beauty, adventure, art, and peace, which were the five pieces that Whitehead told us had been the chart towards the precipitate or the kind of condensation of these things within kind of societal kind of progress, one or the other, that we could either recognize them as present because of progress, present because of civilization, or necessary for the introduction of civilization. Anyway, the warning that we get from that is the fact that we do need to understand that this was a charting of a path to how we arrived previously, and was no guarantee, and was somewhat nostalgic to kind of think that this would always be a way in which one could return to this civilization if it had been lost. And we kind of remarked about the fact that Diderot in his encyclopedia felt that there were certain things that needed to be remembered, but the thing is the path would not be the same. However, there were certain things that really could be lost that were of value that we kind of needed to kind of understand. And this is something that as time goes on, I find that given my history on this earth, that there are certain things that seem to kind of mean concern for me. And I've talked about that later in terms of my relationship to growing up in a time that was very prosperous in terms of the curiosity and imagination and horizon of ideas for a young working class white boy living in Queens, New York, where it literally the sky was the limit. The World's Fair and the success of the space program and NASA was something that boded very well for the potential of people like myself, that someone from the working class, the middle class, could aspire to aspirations and activities that were previously inconceivable even by the most wealthy, powerful people of any previous age. The idea that Neil Armstrong could actually walk on the moon and actually set foot on another kind of body in space. However, the reality was, since 1972, we have not returned. And this kind of idea of a kind of the horizon of ideas being what it was in 1969 probably is still superior to what it is in 2025, though we're kind of inching our way back possibly. But again, this kind of changes the trajectory that one kind of takes in life. So I've kind of talked about that as well. So anyway, one of the things that I feel is important to keep in your mind is the fact that certain things of consequence, if they're lost, sometimes they're so subtle, they're hard to get back. And I think this is one of the ones that we're going to talk about tonight. And we're going to be talking about another one in a couple of weeks. Okay. And yes, honesty as it relates to discourse and entanglement and conditioning. So, and here we are at this one, which is the understanding and judgment as regards authority. And we'll speak about that. I'll also relate to two specific things. One is to a book that I've referred to quite often, which is Ortega Gasset's 1930 book, The Revolt of the Masses. And I think around the same time was Whitehead's Adventures and Ideas. Anyway, so that's the introduction. So let's look into what's new in Julie. So, Puddle?
Yes, Puddle.
Tell us what's new in Julie. Come and tell us what's new in Julie.
Well, I'm unpacking what is new, so maybe you can give it an intro.
Oh, what are we unpacking? You mean the drawing from today?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Julie is about to start. Hold on a second. It's been very hot in New York City these days. It was 100 last week, and it looks like it's going to be in the 90s or high 90s this coming week. as we head into the holiday weekend, 4th of July. Happy birthday, America. And then next year, we will be celebrating our 250th anniversary. Happy birthday, America. Happy 250th coming, if we make it. Anyway,
That's bleak.
well, I mean, honestly, things are weird right now. But anyway, we don't need to go into that.
Okay, I was trying to talk about that.
Okay, so this Julie's new painting is an articulation of a chronicle of an individual called Baron Schmiedel, and he is engaged with these 4 rodents. And these 4 rodents, these mice, basically are his colleagues and cohorts.
May I?
And they have this, they have this very kind of tense and close relationship, given the fact that they see their survival as inherently linked to each other, but at the same time understand the fact that they are not exactly kind of trusting or kind of, in good standing with each other. Anyway, so what happens is Julie and I talked about the fact that the idea of being in a situation where you are kind of trying to kind of stay one step ahead of a very fickle but kind of like frail, emotionally frail kind of potentate king who,
Augustus II.
and having to kind of like keep yourself as the jester, in a kind of position where you've been kind of forced to engage with something that you find repulsive, which is these 4 mice. Anyway, it kind of reminded me of Scheherazade and the 1001 Arabian Nights. So it kind of seems as if like there was a kind of parallel there. But anyway, what Julie's done, if you can see the sketch, is taken a neph, which is a kind of like a table setting piece, which basically is a social marker of hierarchy.
Hold the
But
bottom.
at the same time, they are kind of a lot of glare.
Oh.
Okay, so what happens is, I got it.
Oh, that's a good angle.
Yeah, so what happens is the neph is there, and the neph is being used by one set of the mice to kind of realize that they have to really choreograph these stories and these actions so that Baron Schmiedel can stay one step ahead of this very fickle and kind of emotionally frail king. So that's so far what we've done in terms of kind of like, that's the neph with some of the mice and their kind of like articulations in order to kind of keep the Baron and the actual mice entertaining to the point where the Baron, who's actually not really a Baron, but a jester. So do you have anything else you want to add here in terms of, okay.
Yes. The title of Baron was in my drawing. What's key here is...
Hold that.
Yeah, sure. What's key here in my drawing, I can't really see, is the finery. If you can angle it just a touch this way. Oh, thanks. Is the finery is not the finery of a court jester, but rather the finery of a bona fide baron. Now, he was called that as a title, not a respectful title, a facetious title, a title given to him by people he was not allowed to really be a part of. I mean, he was wearing all of the finery, but it's not his. His clothes are borrowed. His medals are not the medals of a military man. He never fought in the military. He was a court jester for Augustus II. That seems like a good angle. And what I've done in my drawing is his vest, his waistcoat, his silks and lace, all indicators of phenomenal wealth. I mean, he was dressed in very wealthy attire. Again, all of which would be taken away in a millisecond at the whims of a real baron, of the queen, of the king, of any of the noble people who he was meant to entertain. In fact, he had, in addition to the 4 mice who people thought were his pets, and turns out he had a dread, mortal fear of all rodents. So he was forced to work with rodents, hated them, but he actually had a human partner that most people did not know about, named Frolic, and he was imprisoned by Augustus and about to be executed when they plotted his escape, and they pulled a successful prank that got him and Baron Schmiedel back in the good graces of the king. But if this prank had fallen flat, and obviously the previous one had, or Frolic wouldn't have ended up in irons, they would have found themselves in a dungeon where they would have expired. And the dependency of the mice is dependent on their ability to keep the king happy. And the king's happiness is a very transient thing.
Right. So I guess
Yeah,
for me, what's interesting is the fact that what you've kind of depicted is the fact that the mice have now kind of understood that their circumstance has benefited by being inside, so that their domestication is something they look to kind of like maintain. So as a result, they've engaged themselves to kind of take in control of the situation, because they themselves, I mean, the Baron is a jester, but the thing is, if he doesn't succeed in his task, you know, the consequences are very dire, which is the same for the mice, who basically said, we prefer living indoors with the kind of, you know, benefits of this, as opposed to kind of like being back in the field with all the predators that we've kind of previously had to try to evade.
Which is the interior of the jester's chest in my drawing.
Right.
Is an owl grabbing a mouse and disemboweling it.
Right. So that's basically that's where we are. So like, you know, instead of drawing at the Met, what you're doing is been using the Met to kind of correlate the pieces together for the drawing that will basically be the piece for the painting.
It'll be my next painting. I just finished a piece that we discussed in our broadcast last week.
Right.
Can I have some tea?
Yes. So, okay.
Yeah.
So that's this week in Julie. Anything else coming up? Anything we should know about in terms of like what, I mean, you figure how long before you'll be able to kind of start the painting?
Well, I should definitely be able to finish this drawing by next Saturday. In between next Friday and Saturday, I should finish it. So I should be starting the painting pretty quickly. And since this is a much larger scale than I work in watercolors, for those who don't know, with tiny little brushes, we'll have to figure out the scale shift. But my next drawing at the Met will be a topic for future discussion, a discovery that I urge everyone to investigate, which is the newly discovered role of something called a retrotransposon in human health. They've found that these ancient pieces of RNA and DNA, which insert themselves into normal and healthy DNA and just wreak absolute havoc, are called jumping genes and cause all sorts of things, from cancer to ALS to Alzheimer's. And it's a pretty huge scientific discovery. That will be the topic of my next drawing, where I will be using the cane toad as a prevailing metaphor for jumping genes.
Okay, so just to ask here, one of the things that I understand is that lateral or gene transfer or horizontal gene transfer is when something goes out and kind of acquires something, right? Whereas in this case, what's happening is different. Whereas this piece of remnant, which could be from a microbe, could be from a bacteria, could be billions of years old, actually it inserts itself.
It does.
Right. So rather than the gene going and finding a thing rather than the organism going and finding something
Mhm.
and kind of articulating it into its genetic material. This basically is something that has a mechanism that allows it to insert itself and then cause havoc.
Yes, like a doppelganger, like a specter.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
Okay. So it'll be interesting to kind of see how we articulate.
Okay.
All right. So
Here, let me take
two
this off
pieces
of your notes.
that we kind of have here, and is this idea of understanding and judgment as regards authority. Now, authority, let me clarify what I mean by that. Authority in terms of the realm of ideas, not authority in the fact that one holds a position or that one is in a kind of artificially articulated position of authority, like an officer of the law or president or senator or kind of chairperson. That is something I mean where, the position is the thing that kind of like gives a certain person certain responsibilities that need to be kind of appreciated or respected. What I'm talking about is the fact that an individual amongst other individuals in a social sense comes to see or be recognized as having a certain authority within the realm of ideas. So I'll start by reading the very first section from Force and Persuasion, which is in the first book of Adventures of Ideas. So Whitehead says, the gradual development of persuasive agencies in the communal life of mankind was not wholly due to the energizing of ideas. Indeed, the very habit of intellectual activity was promoted by the slow natural development of persuasive intercourse within the social life of each community and between different communities. Evidently, the existence of each family group involves a mixture of love, dependence, sympathy, persuasion, and compulsion. There can never have been any period when the gentler modes of human relations were wholly absent. Indeed, the ferocity may have been later development due to the increase of intelligent self-interest. It may easily have arisen as a strain of character necessary for preservation, and have developed into an overgrowth, checking upward evolution beyond a low key of life. So it is something that we understand moves from the sense of force to a sense of persuasion, which is a force of a kind of like more kind of like elevated term. But the point is, these things have changed over time in terms of their relationship to other things. So persuasion, right, becomes valuable in two ways. One is it kind of forms a bond with reason and logic to better aid itself at being able to be articulate enough to be compelling to other individuals. And second, the idea is this becomes a replacement for the use of force. In primitive societies, you literally would tell people, do this or else. And the kind of like capabilities of individuals to kind of take command was something that was usually done in a different way. Usually the strongest, the most fit, the most able in body, rather than the most able in mind, was the one who became the leader. So now, taking that and going a little further, in this chapter, we consider the effect of some of the natural necessities, such as food and clothing, and also the effects of activities such as commerce, which naturally promote the persuasive reactions within society and between societies. So what happens is there are natural necessities such as food, warmth, and shelter. There are also, and this is the key, there are also the necessities for a coordination of social activities. And that's where this other piece by Ortega in The Revolt of the Masses, in the article on Who Rules in the World, he speaks about a similar thing. By rule, we are not here to understand primarily the exercise of material power or physical coercion. We are here trying to avoid foolish notions, at least the more gross and evident ones. The stable form relation amongst men, which is known as rule, never rests on force. On the contrary, it is because a man or group of men exercise command that they have at their disposition that social apparatus or machinery known as force. The cases in which at first sight force seems to be the basis of command are revealed on a closer inspection as the best example to prove our thesis. Napoleon led an aggressive force against Spain, maintained his aggression for a time, but properly speaking, never ruled in Spain for a single day. And that, although he had the force, and precisely because he had it, it is necessary to distinguish between a process of aggression and a state of rule. Rule is the normal exercise of authority and is always based on public opinion, today as 1,000 years ago, amongst the Englishmen as amongst the Bushmen. Never has anyone ruled on this earth by basing his rule essentially on any other thing than public opinion. This is an important lesson to understand. We, the people in my country, right, understand this, I think, fairly well. If you don't persuade the people to understand that you have their best interest, they won't follow you. Someone basically is elected to power, but stays in power because he basically favors persuasion over coercion. And one of the things I think that has troubled a lot of people recently in my country has been this appeal to a coercive authority rather than that of the rule of public opinion. Because public opinion basically is that which really has to be articulated. Sometimes the public opinion needs to be articulated effectively so that the people who rule can understand what is expected. But there's also the corrective measure where the individual leaders can basically announce the fact that we need to understand that this opinion that we hold in public may be in need of revision as a result of certain things that we may not totally appreciate. So we look to our leaders not only to be able to articulate our desires, but to be able to correct them if necessary, but be able to be persuasive in that they understand what our values are rather than force our values upon us, which is what separates us from some of the socialist and kind of authoritarian rules that we kind of share the planet with. So that's my basic thesis. So anything you want to kind of add or kind of say in relationship to that, my loved one?
Yeah. That I believe most people look for.
What's it?
Oh, it's over there.
Oh, go ahead. Well, don't worry about it.
That most people look for the indications of a leader in macrostructure, and I believe that the true indications of that's hard to say. I'm in the corner, but I think that thanks. I think that the true indications of a leader can be found in the microstructures, not only of their conduct, of their gestures, but of their actual visage, of their face. If you deconstruct a human face, I believe you will find enormous wells of truth, not in the obvious features, but if you take the features apart, if you treat the features as a polis and you pull the face apart and you look objectively at what comprises the totality of this individual, you'll find if they have worth, if they have merit, if they're fraudulent, and we have an awful lot of that going around now. If they are, and this is one of my least favorite human characteristics, if they are disingenuous, you will find honor if there is honor. You will find a lack of honor if that be the case. And I believe all of this can be found. And I say this because never have I seen so many people being so unobservant. And I say this not to just cast a net of aspersions. I say this because it's a very necessary thing to say, and something that I hope people will self-correct, is people are very easy to pass judgment based on a snippet, based on 3 seconds on Instagram. They will not do their research. I mean, even if that means just going to Wikipedia and reading about the person, you can glean an awful lot of information by doing a little bit of research, by observing the person, by looking, examining. Somebody can look but not see. Arthur Conan Doyle, Holmes. So when you take apart a human face into its constituent components, you will not only find a cadre of amazing microstructures that you can analyze, I think you will find the heart of the person right there.
I agree. I mean, there's a piece in Darwin. I think it's the Descent of Man. I think no, it's actually not. It's the one where he talks about. It's the one where he talks about the animals. And I remember you kind of telling me it was interesting anecdote about the fact that people who have too much plastic surgery kind of like had lost certain abilities to have certain emotions.
They cannot mirror, meaning they cannot take what another person is doing and have a response that is meaningful.
Right, because the muscles had been atrophied or had been paralyzed.
And these are actors and actresses who actually live by mirroring and can't do it anymore.
So what I found was that one of the things I found was that, we kind of see the expression of emotions. It was about the expression of emotions. And the thing that was interesting was, the articulations of the face to kind of like register the kind of different senses in terms of sight, sound, etc., was something where, like the body kind of understands this person is looking inward, this person is looking at a distance, this person is looking and straining their eyes, possibly because they're concerned that there might be a predator. So I found that like these were things that were kind of like we had understood the emotional seat behind which these things took place. So now coming to this idea of coercion versus persuasion and substantiation. One of the things to kind of answer your question, why I think we've gotten to this point is that, and I don't know if people are more intellectually lazy now than they were before, but I do sense the fact that there is a situation where one of the things I've always lamented about this is I see few original ideas. And by original ideas, I don't necessarily mean just simply that the idea is unique and has not been articulated by someone else, but that even if you come to a similar conclusion as other people, you came to it not by simply accepting it without leading yourself by some path to that conclusion. So you came to the same result as someone who didn't really kind of take a path, but you did come to that conclusion because you took a path. I always say I'd much rather speak with someone who has the opposite opinion of me or a differing opinion of me, but has gotten there by a slow and reasoned and thoughtful articulation of and formulation than by someone who has no idea but simply agrees with me. Now, this is a minority position, but I've always felt that to get to any position, one has to kind of do the legwork. It's kind of like going to the gym. You go to the gym, you can see the result of the actions that you put in. And you can't kind of like, you can always say, oh, I don't know why this isn't this. It's like, well, there's probably a reason you're maybe just not honest about what that is. But one of the things I think is necessary is the reality of judgment. And what I mean by that is rather than simply passing judgment, understand how to be good at making judgment so that anyone can say, well, I disagree without putting any thought into it.
Mechanisms for making
exactly. So the kind of like understand that in order to be able to kind of deal in the realm of ideas, you have to be able to assess the ideas that come about. So the reality is understanding is a great important thing in terms of getting to the ability to make sound judgments. And I think one of the things that go ahead.
Oh, I don't want to interrupt.
No, go ahead. I'll go back to it.
Okay. I want to bring up the handwriting of the mind, the cursive judgment. And by that, I mean, handwriting has been absolutely lost. We have generations and generations who literally don't know how to write by hand. They have no idea how to write.
I've heard that.
I saw a person on
YouTube said, I'm a person who works in an office. I don't know how to write. I can't, and I thought that's horrifying.
That is the most frightening thing, because a lot of people say, oh, you can just type it or text it. No, here's why it's not a substitute. And this is a key observation. The transcription of thought is utterly and completely different when typed onto a keyboard as it is when it flows through the hand and the fingers articulate the letters, the phrases, the punctuation, the numbers, the words, the tracking, and the kerning. It has been shown, and there are a number of Japanese studies that show that learning is at a deficit, not a small one, an enormous one. People do not remember things very well when they're texting or typing them. In fact, it goes right out the window. When people are writing things by longhand, printing, script.
Would that include drawing?
Yeah. Yeah, that is the handwriting of the mind. That's what I just said. And drawing is the handwriting of the imagination. That's what I call it.
I think so.
And by that, I mean you are emblazoning on paper that which is at the core of your thoughts, and not just your present thoughts, your future thoughts, your potentialities, your past. It's all reactivated. Think of a petri dish. Think of adding a tincture. Suddenly it comes alive and you can see things, layers and layers of microorganisms that are now tinted, that were always there, that are now reawakened. The act of writing is the act of remembering. The act of writing is the act of organizing. The act of writing is conjuring all that is beautiful in the creative mind. And the fact that there are generations of people who literally cannot write is an enormous disadvantage in creative thought. I mean,
we were reading the other day about Macintosh and how they talked about the fact that it was essential that that the guilds and the engineers and the architects were taught to draw. And not simply draw in the kind of, in the kind of narrow draftsman.
Not a remedial way.
Not in the narrow sense of a kind of draftsman in terms of, like, say, being able to kind of draw a cam and a gear and a pinion, but in terms of the ability to kind of like copy drawings of the masters or kind of articulate individual and original drawings. So, Macintosh.
He did beautiful drawings,
yeah.
Nature,
but
they were
it's
amazing.
In Scotland, they made it mandatory for the education of mechanics and engineers and architects to have a sense of drawing in the classical master sense, the same way that Leonardo approached his imagination and creativity, which made sense to us. And the fact that it kind of indicated that what we talked about, and the fact that one of the great things about, Cooper Union's architectural school was they appreciated that idea that was in the Glasgow School of Art architectural program that Macintosh took to understand the reality of needing to be able to draw in the fullest sense. But it kind of follows what you're saying is the most articulate execution of creativity and imagination comes through drawing.
It does.
And there's no substitute for it.
Is drawing. It is drawing of speech. It's drawing of thoughts. It's drawing of literacy. Yeah. It's drawing your mind's literature
in a fundamental
way.
Right.
and it helps you to organize as you write it down.
Right.
You're sculpting every character.
Yeah, you are. You're
Yeah.
also organizing. You're also organized. You know, one of the things that architects do is a sense of kind of the organization of kind of like of activities. But I mean, you know, in order to understand drawing, one has to do the same thing. One has to kind of like articulate that which one wants to kind of visualize and be able to do it in a way that kind of articulates it in the most effective way possible. So, I mean, there is nothing more essential to the kind of the articulation of two-dimensional organizational principles than drawing. So anyway, that I think is a really important idea, is that how do we form our judgments and how do we strengthen that judgment? So I would say that, you know, judgment being linked, having an unbreakable bond with understanding is a very important unbreakable bond that has served us well. And that when we kind of right now, I'd say our societal health is somewhat questionable as relates to judgment coming from understanding, as opposed to judgment basically coming from regurgitation or kind of indoctrination or some other things. And I think the way I see that was in the fact that I don't see original thinking. And, you know, I remember in school, one of the things that was always funny was, you know, in math, they would say, you know, show your work. And, you know, what happens is when you see someone who has an opinion, you can basically see not, you know, how that opinion is not original, because you kind of find that the steps that there's no steps from which that person formed that. And if you do see a kind of process, it's basically the process that's too common, and you see it in everyone else. And you say, like, oh, I've heard this before. You know, one of the things that I always found fun was when I was going to architectural reviews, you know, as part of my job and kind of going amongst the schools in New York City. It was funny because I would listen to someone speak and I would kind of like pretty much tell where they went to school, what year they graduated, and who their professors were, because it was kind of like clear that the stamp, you know, had been kind of made. But again, it wasn't a bad thing, because there was a lot of articulation that the individual could take from that training and kind of form, you know, unique and original and consequential statements. But back to this idea of authority and it being a result of kind of like public opinion. Public opinion is what we generate in the realm of ideas. And the idea that we talk about authority, to me, authority is that which allows an individual to be able to make the more compelling articulations on a more consistent basis than others. One of the things I remember just learning as a result of kind of being around was that individuals who were ahead of me in school or were my professors, I gravitated to those people who were capable of making the most cogent, cohesive, and compelling arguments on the most consistent basis. And I found that that was usually the way a lot of people understood. There was a sense that you wanted to follow these people, listen to these people, learn from these people, because when there would be some kind of group exchange, there was this sense where these were the people who were usually capable of making the most compelling arguments on the most consistent basis. So I found that their authority in terms of their position usually was affected by their authority in terms of their ability to be most persuasive and most compelling on the most consistent basis. I found there was a point where that changed, and I'd say that point was probably the late 1980s or the early 1990s, when basically the academics or the faculty, the professors, went from being the leaders of the academic institutions to the followers of the administrative aspect that basically started to take over. So what have you found for us?
Okay, well, during our discussion of handwriting and its purpose, of this is a portrait that I painted of Bruce back in 2012. It's the second in a series of 4, actually. It's called Reign of the Speculist. The first was Return of the Alchemist, which was actually misappropriated by a certain very famous Buddhist magazine that wrote an entire feature on my painting without talking to
Yeah,
me.
they haven't talked.
They had an interview with me that never took place. It was astonishing. A colleague said, "Hey, I saw that big interview with you in the Buddhist magazine. I won't mention it. It's a big one. And that's great. I had no idea you did an interview with him." He said, "I didn't. They misquoted me based from things that they culled from other people's interviews and did a very bizarre analysis of my painting, which was at that point hanging in a solo exhibition. And they easily could have gotten in touch. But a lot of what they wrote was pure fiction. Should have been science fiction. It was just fiction. But this piece is of particular interest because it uses handwriting more than most of my others, actual typography, calligraphed characters to define a face that I know as well as my own, the one of my loved one. And it's the face of a thinker, the face of an architect, and this is the handwriting that functions as a metaphysical portrait. So I can't think of a more appropriate piece. It is an early piece of mine. See if you can hike it up so they can see the full piece, or would you like me to? Having your hands at the bottom, yes. Okay, so you might want to go super close to see the entire thing I painted in calligraphed strokes, inventing multiple alphabets, not just for the dehydrated fruits, for Bruce's architectural drafting tools. He is made of the very tools that scribe his work. And that's why this is
without
really,
being Archambaldo.
Without being Archambaldo.
Which that was the thing. Is like,
Yes.
I don't want to see
Yes.
a librarian made of books.
No, he is not made of cauliflower.
No.
But
I
if
enjoyed
you
being made of
actually-
characters, though.
Yes, he's made
A
and if
character
you
made of
actually-
characters.
A character made. Okay, if you zoom in on the eye,
Mhm.
it is a study in plant science where the pupil and the iris have imploded and have morphed into a dandelion being blown away by their own force. Bruce's eyebrows are curled and coiled, inspired by one of my favorite typefaces called Folk Wang that I've used in many of the books I designed. One of those great hand-drawn faces that was completely bastardized when it was digitized. So here is the wall text which accompanied this piece in several exhibitions and is very prescient, if you'd like to read it, to exactly what we're talking about now.
Okay,
So,
Reign of the Speculist,
yes.
2012, watercolor on paper, 18 and an eighth by 12 and 3/4 inches. In Julie Rauer's ongoing series of anthro-botanical portraits, an idea sporulates from the mind of one who speculates across disciplines. Philosopher of the effervescent postulation, chrysalis thinker teetering on the event horizon of neuronal connection. Manifesting aspects of mycology, neuroscience, temporal physics, entomology, and plant science. This piece, structured by Edo period kabuki portraits of samurai, finds the speculist Julie Art Science Complex co-founder Bruce Gemmell sheltering himself from the deluge above, grasping a shiitake mushroom engineered to protective umbrella proportions, buttressed by foundational philosophies of individual honor and nobility, of purpose, graced with idealized mythic family crest of dehydrated Meyer lemons and hoary mission figs bound by calligraphic strokes. The speculist is drowning from below, unaware that his kimono, a network of engorged cork tree cells, has shifted properties to an altered state. Physics operating in cloaked hierarchy, one iris sees with clarity ocular Janus of altering past and potential futures. The other disperses as a spent dandelion blown apart. That's cool.
Yeah,
I remember
thought
that.
It was very, very apropos.
Yeah.
We haven't looked at it in a while, but
No, we haven't.
this is the calligraphy of a mind
Hmm.
without being the Arcimbaldo
Right.
effect. Bruce is not
So-
made of broccoli.
No. So I think that kind of we're kind of start to kind of
Mhm.
close up here is that one of the things I think that happens is the ability to make a compelling argument, to be persuasive, to the point where people start to understand that the public opinion, is formed by these by these dialogues, so that that ability of an individual to kind of gather authority by being able to consistently make compelling arguments. I mean, one of the things I enjoyed, like I said, was being able to be present when these types of things took place. And this is another thing I think has also happened and is kind of starting to start to disappear. In fact, I remember, again, I won't mention places because I don't feel it's fair without kind of asking permission first. I also don't.
We don't want to
There are
get sued.
Yeah, the other thing is I think there's other people who don't deserve the attention.
Yeah.
But one of the things I remember, in the course of my tenure in teaching was that when I was a student and when I was a young professor, the doors of the different studios were always open. In fact, it was only later on that I actually realized that the studios had doors at all, because they were always open. There were always this kind of cross-pollination of people going back and forth. And, what happened is if you heard clamor, sometimes rooms would empty and people would kind of go across the hall or across the hallway or kind of follow the action and the interest of what was going on. It was a very active kind of society. And it was kind of distressing to me when I was in the hall and it was so quiet. I thought, is school closed? And I noticed that there were doors on the rooms. And I thought, I don't remember doors.
It's the hushing of knowledge.
Exactly. And it was basically the fact that individuals had kind of lost the ability to exist in the public realm. And the public forum of ideas had been coerced, and now we were kind of getting, and it was interesting because I went into just opened one of the doors, and there was this young professor. Well, I mean, young, she was my age. And she asked me, like, can I help you? And I said, no, I was just curious. It's like, and she goes, who are you? And I said, I introduced myself. And then what happened was I went back into the hallway and she came out and goes, what the hell are you doing? It's like, what are you talking about? And the thing was, what was interesting was she had been brought up in this cloistered kind of secret society type thing where there was no.
It's a great place to cower, isn't it?
It was, and it was the thing is, and she kind of was like, "What are you doing? You're trying to do the," and she was like all accusatory and things like this, and I was like, "What is wrong with this person?"
It takes courage to exist in the realm of public knowledge.
It does, and I mean, like I say, the realm of ideas is not for everyone, and for some people, it's not for you.
It's a bold frontier.
It is. Well, it didn't used to be. It was just, but the thing is, that's the thing.
Surely is now.
And it was, because the idea was, we enjoyed the realm of ideas. We enjoyed the idea of kind of going into this realm and watching this, incredible kind of drama unfold, because we would, see ideas be presented. We would see them fall. We would see them rebuilt. We'd watch them articulate. It was so beautiful. I mean, it was like the greatest.
Was it kinetic?
It was kinetic, yeah.
Exactly.
So, and to see this now where there was all this subterfuge and coercion and kind of all these other inarticulate kind of non-persuasive methods being deployed. It was kind of like I was in
a cemetery.
No, cemeteries are still great places because life grows from the dead. But it was like when I was in London, I was at that architectural panel discussion after I came back from Russia. And I remember, this idea where people were trying to substitute, kind of like we saw with Jesse, where we had substituted the final critique and final jury with an opening.
It was a party. It wasn't a critique.
So anyway,
Yeah.
the thing that was interesting was, rather than understanding the articulation of ideas and kind of formulations of thoughts, we were now in this kind of like situation where we were now just kind of having conversations amongst ourselves, but there was no grand forum. And I remember saying, I said, I don't believe that criticism is some kind of relic of the past or some kind of nostalgia or sentimental thing.
Quaint,
it's an essential aspect of how we articulate ourselves and understand that we can see where we are going. And I felt that it was a kind of like, it was a fearful, cowardly thing to try to move away from this, just like it was a cowardly thing to close the door.
Yeah.
My feeling is I need to be able to speak about whatever the topic is, whenever the time is, whenever it's necessary. And I believe the intellectual, the individual who lives in the realm of ideas needs to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we cower and we move away from that and we look for excuses, sometimes people will hide behind authority and say, well, I'm the dean, or I'm this, or I'm that. And my feeling is there's nothing that says an expert is not capable. And in fact, we expect them, because they've spent time studying and doing the work, that they aren't likely to be able to make the most articulate, kind of consequential kind of argument. It's just that it's not always it's not always possible, and it's not always the case. So the thing is, you expect a person who studied a topic deeply to have a good opinion and have a deep understanding, but it's not a given, and it doesn't mean they always will.
No.
And I think that when we go away from that public display, go away from that public forum, we don't know. Right. And then, like, we don't have that ability to have that discussion. We don't get that articulation. So that to me is troubling. Anyway, so final thoughts, my loved one, because we're going to go on to the next topic, my loved one.
A true, genuine critique, and I don't mean a flurry of insults or backbiting. I mean a professional, well-reasoned, thoughtful, insightful critique is a clarion call to a progressive future.
Agreed.
That's what I
absolutely
think.
100%. And
I mean, without it, we are mired in the kind of
unsubstantiated judgments.
And petty bickering,
exactly.
And the kind of mire.
So like I said, I think one of the things that for me has always been important is I would much rather have a discussion with someone who has a deep and thoughtful opinion that may be completely the polar opposite of mine, because the reality is, my expectation is, if I'm going to articulate my thoughts on a topic, it's usually something I feel fairly good about because I have put the time in. So I'd rather do that than be with someone who says, "Oh, I agree with you." It's like, well, how did you get to this conclusion? Oh, I don't know. Or
that's nice, or that's
exactly.
pretty, which is meaningless.
Right, exactly. So the realm of ideas is free to all, but it's kind of like there's an effort that's necessary in order to kind of sustain yourself there. So I think that the idea is look for that authenticity of authority. Look for that individual who's capable of making compelling arguments on a consistent basis, and be truthful to that. One of the things we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks is honesty as relates to discourse, which I think is a very troubling thing because I find that there is a tremendous dishonesty. And so Unbreakable Bonds is freedom of the next week. It's going to be after the 4th of July. Happy birthday, America. Yeah. 224 years old. Or no, 249 years old. And the unbreakable bond of freedom and tolerance. Okay, so thank you. Thank you. The realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to maintain this.
Amen to that.
Yes.